Hi, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read you a story about Fancy Nancy. And I have never read this story before, so it's going to be new for me and for you too. Nancy likes to be fancy. That means kind of looks extra special. Look at her. She's got a lot of crazy things in her hair, an extra bow, and she's wearing frilly socks and high heel shoes, and she's carrying an umbrella. So let's find out what this story is about. Fancy Nancy by Jane O'Connor. Wow, she sure is fancy. This is my room, says Nancy. This is my room before I made it fancy. Looks like a nice room. Oh my. Look at it now. Woo! I love being fancy. Wow, look, she even put Christmas lights on her mirror. My favorite color is fuchsia. That's a fancy way of saying purple. I love to write my name with a pen that has a plume. That's a fancy way to say a feather. And I can't wait to learn French because everything in French sounds very fancy. Nobody in my family is fancy at all. They never even ask for sprinkles on their ice cream. There's a lot they don't understand, like lace-trimmed socks help me play soccer better, and sandwiches definitely taste better when they have frilly toothpicks stuck in them. A princess is supposed to keep her tiara on at all times. What's a fancy girl to do? I asked Maribel. My doll's full name is Maribel Lavinia Chandelier. Then I get an idea that is stupendous. That's a fancy word for saying great. Maybe I can teach my family how to be fancy. I make an ad and stick it on the refrigerator, and it says, "Learn to be fancy with lessons from Nancy. Start today. It's easy, it's fun, and it's free." Soon there is a knock on my door, and my family must have seen the ad, and they all come and we get started right away. The trouble is, my family doesn't own any fancy clothes. That's okay. I go find, what's that fancy word I'm thinking of? Oh yes, I find some accessories. Oh my goodness, look. Ooh la la, my family is posh. That's a fancy word for fancy. My mom twirls in front of the mirror. Why don't we go somewhere fancy tonight? How about dinner at the King's Crown, my dad suggests. Wow, my parents are acting fancier than usual. May I escort you lovely ladies outside? The limousine is waiting. Dad is our chauffeur. That's a fancy word for a driver. When we arrive at the King's Crown, everyone looks up. They probably think we are movie stars. I am so proud of my whole family. They eat with their pinkies up and call each other darling. For dessert, let's have parfaits, my mom says. That's a French word for ice cream sundaes. Amazing, my mom knows French. When our parfaits are ready, I curtsy and say, "Merci." That's a fancy way to say thank you. I carry the tray like a fancy waiter, but I trip and I slip, and the tray does a double flip. Uh-oh, and I don't feel fancy anymore. I want to go home. You know what? She's feeling embarrassed. After I get all cleaned up, I put on my dressing gown. That's a fancy word for robe. And I feel much better. I'm ready for a parfait, I tell my parents. Thank you for being fancy tonight. I love you, says Dad. I love you, says Mom. And all I say back is, I love you too, because there isn't a fancy or better word to say that. The end. I like that story. Fancy Nancy. She uses a lot of new words for things, doesn't she? She doesn't say purple, she says fuchsia, because that's more fancy. She doesn't say feather, she says plume, because that's more fancy. She likes frilly toothpicks and lacy socks. And instead of saying great, she says stupendous, because that's more fancy. She sure likes to be fancy. She doesn't say Sundays, she says parfaits. She doesn't say car, she says limousine, because that's more fancy. She doesn't say driver, she says chauffeur. And she walks, and they all go out to dinner, and they all say, oh darling, oh darling. And when they eat or drink, they lift up their pinky, because that's fancy. Do you remember what happened to Nancy that made her feel embarrassed? She dropped all the parfaits on the floor and slipped and fell and made a big mess. She didn't want anybody to see her like that. She didn't want anyone to know what happened. She felt embarrassed, just like Hedgie did when he was wearing that sock on his head. Yeah, well, but she got over it. She left and she got all cleaned up, and her mom even made parfaits at home. Parfaits is a fancy word for ice cream sundaes. I like ice cream sundaes. I like parfaits. All right, boys and girls, that was the story of Fancy Nancy. See you next time. Bye.